Buenos días. Es un honor poder presentar al profesor Weiler, profesor de la Universidad de Nueva York, que mañana será investido Doctor Honoris Causa en la Universidad de Navarra. Como decano, digo que es un honor y habrá ocasión de comprobarlo en la lección, la lecture, que a continuación pronunciará. El tema de la disertación, y yo a continuación ya le doy la palabra, es la crisis de legitimación en el proceso de la Unión Europea. No voy a hacer más presentaciones, puesto que mañana tendrá lugar ya el acto de investidura con la laudatio y es el momento adecuado. Tiene la palabra el profesor Weiler.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor and a great privilege for me to be here and talk to you. So I know that everything on our mind now is the crisis. There will be a meeting tonight of the heads of state or government, and will they find a solution to the euro problem, or will they not, and will it be a good enough solution, and blah, 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 blah. Very important stuff. But that's not exactly what I want to talk about, although what I do want to talk about will have something important at the end also about the current crisis. I want to talk about deeper things, things that are not just the last year or the last month or since Lehman Brothers or since Greece, etc., but real deep structural problems of the European Union. That the real, to go au fond, things that are important independently of the euro crisis, but are also relevant to the euro crisis. Okay? So, when we talk about legitimacy of a political regime, what do we mean? In every regime, forever, there are those who govern and those who are governed. We. They govern, we are governed. And the question of legitimacy is whether the act of government, the exercise of public power, is, now listen carefully, from a social point of view, acceptable. Empirically, do the people accept that what the government is doing is legitimate, that they are entitled to do that? It doesn't mean that you agree with what they're doing. You can be a socialist and you can have a conservative government. You hate what they're doing, but you accept that they are entitled to do it because they are the government. That's legitimacy. It's not that I like it, but I don't say it's illegitimate. I say I don't like it, I hope it changes, I'm going to vote for somebody else, but I don't say it's not. So that's an empirical social question. So we have a second complementary criterion of legitimacy, which is normative. It's not only do the people socially accept that it's legitimate, but whether, according to some political theory, a normative political theory, normative doesn't translate well in Spanish, valorativo, not normative. From a value point of view, this kind of government is legitimate. So we need these two conditions. Usually, we say for a government to be legitimate from a value point of view, it has to be democratic. And not only democratic, but it has to be liberal and pluralist, respect fundamental human rights, because the majority can do terrible things. Right? You can have a majority in parliament which will decide that everybody who wears a red tie, like you and I, will have their head chopped off. That's democratic. If a majority says so, that's democracy. No. We says democracy has to respect certain values. Individual rights, human dignity, rights of minority, etc. Only when democratic government accepts it is it legitimate from the value normative point of view. Chiaro? So now, there's a real long-term question mark about the legitimacy of the European Union using these criteria. The first problem is that it really suffers from a deep-seated, profound democracy deficit. And I want to explain why I hold that the European Union suffers from a long-term, profound democracy deficit. Forever, which has not been cured by the Treaty of Lisbon, and which would not have been cured by the European Constitution, which the Spanish people enthusiastically embraced. So we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean when we say democracy? And we have to look for a primitive definition. Why a primitive definition? Because there are lots of systems of democracies. France has a presidential system. Britain has a parliamentary system. Spain, I don't even begin to understand what system it is. No, I'm just joking. Is it allowed in Navarra to tease your students? So we have to find the primitive common denominator. Doesn't matter, France, Britain, Spain, Italy, Germany, they all share these things. It's like when you have something of gold, it's got a mark on it. If you see the mark, it's gold. If there's no mark, it's not gold. So what are the hallmarks of democracy? There are also different theories of democracy, not only distant systems of democracy. There is consociational democracy, liberal democracy, neoliberal democracy. Habermas likes to speak about deliberative democracy, all kinds of theories of democracy. And I want to find something that no matter what theory you take, also you have to have these elements. So I reduce it to two propositions. That's simple, huh? Usually everything is three, this is two. If you don't have these two things, it's not democracy. Primitivski, really primitive. One thing we learned from the English, they have a wonderful expression. I don't know how to translate it, but somebody has to translate it into Spanish. Throw the scoundrels out. Who wants to translate? Throw, you know what scoundrels are? Bad people. When you get tired of the government, in democracy, you have the possibility to change the government, to throw the scoundrels out. You like Zapatero? If you live in a democracy, you should have the possibility, if enough people think like you, to throw him out. If we conceptualize this, bravo. If we conceptualize it, we have a big word for it, the principle of accountability. Government has to be accountable. And if they are accountable, it means the possibility to throw them out and change the government. So the first basic primitive principle of democracy, France, Britain, Spain, if it's the possibility to throw the scoundrel out, to change the government, the principle of accountability. The second principle is the principle of representation. If enough people vote in the same way on the same day, it should have an impact on what the government does. So the difference in today's world between Christian Democrats and Social Democrats is not enormous, right? Christian Democrats believe in the welfare states and Social Democrats believe in the market. But nonetheless, there is a difference. If you have a government of Schröder or government of Merkel, it's going to be different in taxes, in foreign policy. Not huge differences, but there will be a difference. If you have a Labour government in Britain or a Tory government in different, it makes a difference. Not a huge difference, but it makes a difference. The kind of legislation, the kind of taxation, the kind of rules, the actions of the government will be different if you have a center-left or a center-right. That's the principle of representation. You don't have that, you don't have democracy. Representation and accountability. Very primitive, that's why I like it. Because no matter what theory you have to respect these two basic principles. Now, the little problem of the European Union is that it respects neither. And let me explain. We in the European Union have governance, but we don't have government. In other words, we are governed. You remember, you don't remember, you weren't born, but in 1990, Jacques Delors said by the end of the century, 80% of social legislation will come from Brussels. It's 20 years later. I don't know if it's 80% or 70% or even 50%. But even if it's only 50% of social legislation coming from Brussels, that's a lot. That is a lot of governance, right? When we are telling Greece, you have to do this, you have to do that, it's not only governments, it's also Brussels speaking. You with me? The most important instrument of policy in times of peace that a government has is monetary policy. That's European today. All our interface with globalization, trade with the rest of the world, aid to the, it's all European Union. Those of you who study the law of the European Union, it's the common commercial policy, exclusive community competence. There is a lot of governance, and it's important governance, right? But there is no government. The Commission is not the government of the European Union, correct? The Council of Ministers is not the government of the European Union. There is no day in the civic calendar of the European Union where if enough people go and vote in a certain way, they can throw the government out. It doesn't exist. Structurally, it doesn't exist. You with me? It's an even deeper problem. The fact that there's governance without government does not only mean that we cannot take that supreme act of throwing the government out. Enough with Schröder, now Merkel. Enough with Merkel, now I don't know who. Right? There is no political accountability in Europe. These are strong words, correct? But I defy anyone to give me a single instance in the last 60 years of political accountability in the European Union. I'm not talking about personal corruption, somebody putting money in their pocket or arranging a concorso so that their nephew wins it. No, that's criminal accountability. I'm talking about political accountability, where a politician fails and resigns. I'm still waiting to hear one instance in the history of the European Union where there has been any political accountability, where the president of the commission resigned, or a commission, not for personal corruption, but for political failure. It doesn't exist. It's not on the vocabulary. You still with me? Let's go even deeper. Deep. In Europe, we have a profound political deficit. The Commission, by design, is meant not to be party politics, neither left nor right. If Barroso said, when he was young, he was a Maoist, then he became on the right, you know, whatever his politics. But if Barroso says, I'm a socialist and therefore I support this, or I'm a conservative, or therefore I support this, people would say, no, no, you're not allowed to do that. You're breaking the rules. You meant to be apolitical. You meant to serve the whole of Europe. You might, no, this is before you were born. There was a time that the big member states, and Spain was considered a big member state, used to send 2 commissioners. You with me? It's very interesting. So Britain would send 2 commissioners, and the government would appoint one from the left and one from the right. France would appoint one from the left, one from the right. Germany, one from the left, one from the right. Spain, one from the left, the other from the left. No, just just teasing. But that shows you the ethos, that it's not meant to play party politics, ideological difference. It's meant to be functional, pragmatic, etc. But that's a problem for democracy. The Council of Ministers is not, it's bad form if Merkel goes to the Council of Ministers and says, since I'm elected as a Christian Democrat, I'm going to pursue Christian Democrat politics in the Council of Ministers. They would say, no, no, that's not how we work. You represent Germany, I represent France. You do not represent an ideological line. So how can you have politics without politics? How can you have democracy without politics when you don't actually have a choice? So the first criterion of accountability doesn't exist. Also representation. So when we go to representation, it is true there are elections to the European Parliament, and there can be a majority in the European Parliament of the Social Democrats, the center-left, or the center-right. But every study has shown that it makes absolutely no difference to the legislative output of the European Union whether in the European Parliament there's a center-left majority or a center-right majority. It makes no difference. In fact, sometimes that wonderful institution, they even decide to rotate the presidency. So half the legislature it's Christian Democrat, half the legislature it's Socialist. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. Long before you were born. That's the 3rd time I've said this. When I was just a little bit older than you, I wrote my first book. It's a book I try to forget now. It was about the European Parliament. And one of the things I said with great confidence was the following. It is true that the turnout, the voter turnout for elections to the European Parliament is very low. But the electorate is not stupid. The European Parliament has no power, so why should they go and vote for it? But then I wrote, you will see that when the European Parliament gains power, the rate of participation in elections will increase. That's what I wrote. Sounds reasonable, right? So from 1979 until now, this is the power of the European Parliament. It is now a co-legislature. No legislation can be passed without the agreement of the European Parliament. That's a lot of power. This is the rate of participation in elections to the European Parliament. How wrong could I be? But on one thing I was right. The people are not stupid. They didn't vote for the European Parliament then because the European Parliament had no power. And they don't vote for the European Parliament now because they know that their vote makes no difference. If there's a majority on the left or majority of the right, it's not translated in what the European Union does. So why should I waste? In some countries, it's a holiday. I better go to the beach than go and vote if it makes no difference. So now you're going to tell me the following. You're going to say, that might be true. But on the whole, the European Union enjoys a lot of social legitimacy. Historically, people have accepted it. Correct? Democracy is process legitimacy. We accept the legitimacy of the government, of what they govern, because they govern in the name of democracy. But there can be another social legitimacy, which is not process legitimacy, but which is output legitimacy, result legitimacy. And I call it bread and circus because the Roman emperors discovered this 2,000 years ago. They abolished the republic. It was no longer democratic, but they kept for quite a long time the people very happy. Why? Bread and circus. As long as there's prosperity and as long as there's entertainment, the people will support you. Hail Caesar. So I have two problems with this. One is a normative problem. I don't like bread and circus legitimacy. That is being the method of all dictatorships. They keep the people happy by giving them good results. Even benign dictatorships, I don't like. Churchill was right. Democracy is a terrible system, but it's the best we have. So, to buy legitimacy simply because of results is not a way that I am proud to be a citizen. It debases me as a citizen. So I don't like the bread and circus, the output legitimacy. But there's a second problem with it. When we've tested it scientifically, quite recently, the work of an American social scientist by the name of Martin Shane, we discovered something very interesting. So we look at the results of Eurobarometer. Eurobarometer is where European citizens are asked, do you like this, do you like that? Costs a lot of money and it makes the Commission feel happy because they always say, we like you. Except recently. So now they might abolish Eurobarometer. No, just teasing. So on the whole, Eurobarometer has always had positive results. The majority of citizens in Europe are pro-Europe. They support the European Union. But what Martin Shane did, and nobody did this before him, he analyzed the questions. And it turns out that when you ask them, do you like what the European Union is doing? Not so much. They always like what it promises to do. So it's a complicated explanation for the legitimacy of the European Union because result legitimacy depends on the results. And we have two problems. First of all, how do we explain the first years when there were no results? And secondly, when we look carefully at the data, they're actually not so happy with the results. So we need a third explanation for the legitimacy of the European Union despite its democracy deficits, despite the absence of process legitimation, and apparently despite the absence of output legitimation. So now I go to one of the most wonderful historians of Europe, Mark Mazower. He's got a book, Europe, the Dark Century. It's not about the European Union. It's about the history of Europe in the 20th century. And he has a very interesting thesis. Because he says, at the beginning of the 20th century, the most important form of legitimation he calls political messianism. Messianism, from Messiah. It's not process democracy, legitimacy. There's no democracy in Germany. There's no democracy, right? And it's not about results. It's about promise of grandeur, empire. We will be important, right? That's why he calls it political messianism. You come with a political messianic message. This is Mark Mazower, and I find it a very, very convincing thesis. I find it a convincing thesis, the description of Europe, and I find very important conceptually to explain life, social and political life, the notion of political messianism. It really mobilizes people. Not what you give them, not what they do through process democracy, but the future you promise them. Now, I have my little innovation. At the end of the Second World War, the member states turned to process democracy. But this wonderful, and I say this with no cynicism, this wonderful, noble experiment of European integration, the European community, if you read the Schuman Declaration, Google it later, it's a political messianic project. You read the Schuman Declaration, 9th of May 1950, setting out the vision. It's bombastic. World peace will not be made all at once. We need a European Union so that war will not only be impossible, but will be unthinkable. We will bring civilization to the rest of the world. You read it. It's a great, wonderful, noble message. But you can take out a magnifying glass, you can even take out a microscope. You will not find the word democracy. You will not find the word human rights in the Schuman Declaration. And the system they set up is not interested in democracy. They set up something they call an assembly, which later calls itself the European Parliament, which has zero powers. Officially, zero power. It's a consultative body. The real power is in the hands of the doers. Government ministers, Council of Ministers, public officials, fonctionnaires, in the high authority which becomes the Commission. And why do they do it? Because of the great vision. Now, make no mistake, the European Union is not communism or fascism. It's a wonderful thing. It's a noble experiment. It's about the future, a future of peace, a future of prosperity. Jean Monnet writes, nous ne coalisons pas des États, nous unisons des hommes. We do not bring states together. We unite human beings. That's a metaphysical, spiritual objective. We are not just doing politics. We are changing the way human beings relate to each other. This is a political messianic message. It's about a better future, given the terrible past that we've just lived through, the Second World War. And because of that, let's just do it and not worry about democracy and not worry about parliament and not worry about... And we put in place a wonderful structure that can achieve those aims. Democratic it is not. Democratic it is not. And that is what legitimates European integration for decades. It's always idealism. To believe in European integration is to be an idealist. Not to believe in European integration is to be selfish. Correct? A tremendous mobilizing power. Now, before all of you run out, just teasing, we can come to the present and understand the depth of our legitimacy crisis. Because I want to explain to you something structural about the phenomenology, big word, the phenomenology of political messianism as a legitimating agency. It always fails. I want to explain to you why it always fails. It is not sustainable in the long run. It fails, obviously, if you don't realize the promise of the big vision, right? The Messiah doesn't come, so obviously it fails. But it also fails when it succeeds. Why does it fail when it succeeds? For two reasons. It always fails, also when it succeeds. First of all, there's no doubt in our mind that Europe has been very successful in reconciling the 200-year enmity between the French and the Germans. But it's been so successful that when François Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl went before the French people and tried to persuade them to vote yes in the referendum of Maastricht and said, this is about the historical reconciliation between the French and the German, everybody below the age of 50 didn't know what they were talking about because the reconciliation was so complete. The enmity disappeared. So it ceased to be a mobilizing factor. But it fails structurally for another reason. Because every messianic project, when it is realized, reality is messy. Marriage is never quite what you think it's going to be when you propose. A good way to show the difference, the Schuman Declaration, the vision is 836 words. The reality, the Treaty of Lisbon, is 156,000 words. Messy, detailed. The dream, when it's realized, is never a dream. It's like paradise is paradise only when it's lost. When you actually go into the reality, it's all very, very messy. And therefore, the political messianic message fails to mobilize. That is the case with all. That was the case with National Socialism. That was the case with communism. Once they achieved their wonderful communist state, at the end of it, everybody hated it. Because the reality is not like the dream. You promise a lot, and when you actually have to live the reality, it's just messed up. And that's where we are in Europe today. We have a deep legitimacy crisis. Political messianism, which sustained and legitimated European integration for several decades, no longer acts as a legitimating factor. It's very difficult for Merkel or Sarkozy or anybody to go before the people and give a nice speech about the dream of European integration. It's a joke if they try and do that. The people spoke. When this dream was proposed as a constitution for Europe, it was rejected. And it wasn't rejected by the Irish, although they would have rejected it too. It was rejected by the French. It was rejected by the Dutch. And believe me, if the French and the Dutch had voted first, it would have been rejected by a lot of other peoples. I know in your country the referendum was positive, but if you look at the number of people who went to vote, it was less than a third of the electorate. So political messianism is dead as a mobilizing factor in Europe. Democracy, look at the numbers of people who went to vote in the last elections to the European Parliament. Historical low, below 43%. And that includes 2 countries where elections are obligatory. If you took out those countries, it would be between 35 and 40%. And in some countries, it was as low as 20%. And you shouldn't say, oh, but in America, the presidential elections is also only 49% to 50. No, you have to compare it with the rate of participation in national elections, to the Spanish parliament, to the German Bundestag, etc. The difference is huge. And result legitimacy, I have called into doubt result legitimacy historically. But today, if you ask most people, is Europe succeeding? Is Europe succeeding? It doesn't matter if realistically it is. I think it's succeeding much more than people believe it. I think Barroso is making a huge mistake by saying if we don't solve the euro crisis, it's the end of Europe. It's a terrible mistake. Europe is there with the euro crisis and without the euro crisis. And in some deep sense, it's a big success. But that's not what counts. The perception is that Europe is failing. So the 3 pillars by which we achieve legitimation of any political project: process legitimacy, democracy; result legitimacy, bread and circus; output legitimacy; and political messianism, all of them have lost their grip, their traction, their power to mobilize support for the European Union project. What does that mean? Take the euro crisis. Take the euro crisis, and I finish. It may be hard for you to hear, but most people in Northern Europe do not like the idea that they have to take their savings and their taxes to pay off Spanish debt, or Portuguese debt, or Italian debt, or Greek debt. So some will say, well, if we don't do it, the situation will be even worse. But they are very upset that this is the case, that they have to do it. And others say, forget about them. Why? It's, like the ant and the grasshopper. While we were working and saving, they were singing in the sun. And now the winter has come and they say, give us from your grain. No, you can go and dance now. That's the political social reality. The political social condition, there is no legitimacy for Europe to act as Europe in this deep sense that in Canada or the United States or Austria or Australia is totally understood. I hesitate to say Spain. I don't quite understand the Basque arrangement. I'm not sure there's fiscal federalism here, and I'm not even sure that there's the social and political reality of fiscal federalism in this country. I said I'm not sure. But certainly it doesn't exist in Europe. So what does that mean? And with this I will end. That our leaders really face a big dilemma. Because a breakdown of the euro will really be quite cataclysmic. It won't destroy the European Union, but it will destroy a lot of lives. It will make a lot of people much poorer than they are today. It will be detrimental to our social services. It will be detrimental to many things. And therefore, what they have to do, and the only thing they can do, which is one kind of form of fiscal federalism, it's a European response to this crisis. They have to do in a political environment and a political structure which does not enjoy the legitimacy that would normally be associated with that action, and in many cases does not even enjoy democratic legitimacy within the member states. Great leaders sometimes do that. They say some things are more important than being re-elected. But it's not an easy situation to be in. Thank you very much.
It's a great honor for me to make you this question. So my question has to do with the current euro crisis. Do you think that this crisis is just about monetary and economic policy crisis, or if the euro crisis is affecting to the very essence of the European Union? Is the European Union to be destroyed by this crisis, or it's about more things?
Okay, this I can say something. So I will say two things about the euro crisis which you don't read every day in the newspaper, because there's no point in me just to repeat the Financial Times, right, or the Economist. One has a crisis in Spain, but what one does not say, oh, we have to get rid of Spain. Spain is the context, that's where we are, and we have to try and solve our crisis. When there's a crisis in Italy, oh, they love crisis. It can be deep crisis, constitutional crisis, etc. But they don't say, okay, let's go back to pre-unification 1870, and they say we have to find a solution to our crisis. But Italy is not put up for discussion. You with me? Or in France. France is not put up for discussion. So now we have had 60 years of European integration. At the beginning, it was a choice. You could go this way, you could get that way. Slowly, it became part of our life. And I had believed, and I do believe, that for most Europeans and for most European countries, the question of Europe as such is off the table. It's unthinkable that we would not be part of the European Union. The only question is, what kind of European Union do we want to be part of? With these powers, without these powers, more trade, more human rights, but the European Union, it's just to be a Spanish citizen means to be a Spanish citizen and a European citizen. There's no other way of thinking about it. Now, come people, and I mentioned the President of the Commission in this big speech he gave to the European Parliament. And in my view, they're making a very fundamental mistake, because I know they're doing it for good motives. They want to galvanize the government to take decisive action. So they are saying, if you don't do it, the whole European Union would disappear. That's not true. Why would the single market disappear? We had the single market before the euro. We'll have the single market with the euro. We will have the single market. There will be very grave social and economic consequences to a failure of the euro for France, but France is not going to disappear. Spain is not going to disappear. The European Union is not going to disappear. It will be a European Union with grave economic and social consequences. So I simply find intolerable that people are taking us backwards. They're calling into question the project because they are leveraging. It's like wolf, wolf, wolf. And they are themselves, they're not just delegitimating the European Union, they're taking it back so that the European Union itself becomes part of the problem. It's not. The European Union is the context. Now it's just if we find a good solution or bad solution or no solution, but the context should not be up for discussion. That is my belief. But it's being undermined. In Britain, forever, a referendum, but that's the English malaise. But it's bad for me to see that the most pro-European are introducing the English malaise into Europe, and they're doing it in order to scare people that you have to do something, otherwise the whole union is. You have to do something because of the social and human costs of a collapse of the euro. Big social human costs. But the European Union, it will be a European Union with big social and human costs. That's the first thing. I want to say another thing about the euro crisis. Much more important. I hate to use this word again. I've said democracy much too many times. But there's a failure of national democracies in all our states. Listen, what does democracy mean? Democracy doesn't mean that the government has to be accountable to us. That's only part of democracy. In a good democracy, when the government acts, it's because we told them to act. We are responsible. Democracy is the rule of the people, democracy, right? So I don't say George Bush was terrible, the war in Iraq. I say the American people were terrible because the majority voted for him and a majority of Congress voted for the war in Iraq. So don't put your finger at George Bush. It's the American Congress and a majority of the American people. They have to be responsible because that's what democracy means. It's not only the accountability of the government to you, it's your accountability for what your government has done because they are ruling in your name. You voted for them. You are responsible. So now, there is a deep failure in all our national democracies. We have never owned up to the debt we incurred. It's not the government that has debt. It's you that have debt because you like wonderful roads and you love social security and you like free universities and you like good medical services and somebody has to pay for it, right? Now, if your family wanted to buy a good private health insurance or send the kid to the University of Navarra where you have to pay, right? Then somebody would ask, where's the money? Okay? And then you would have to take a decision. Is it sufficiently important for me to send my kid? Believe me, I ask that question every day. Is it sufficiently important to me to send my kid to Stanford University, which will cost me $50,000 a year? And if I decide it is sufficiently important to me and I take a mortgage, if I borrow the money to send my son to Stanford University, and afterwards there's a mini Weiler euro crisis, I can only blame myself. I decided to take the loan and now I'm in debt because I decided it was important for me to send him to university. You with me? I blame myself. It was my decision. We, the citizens of Europe, we decided to get ourselves into debt. We want free universities, wonderful health insurance, motorways, this beautiful new railway from Barcelona to Madrid, etc. Who's going to pay for it? In the family, we would say, do we have the money? We don't. We have to borrow the money. Is it sufficiently important to borrow the money? What happens if we lose our job and we can't pay? Yeah. In our democracy, nobody asked the question, right? So that's my second answer to the euro.
It's a short question.
But I give long answers, huh?
Yeah. In your opinion, does the failure of the euro imply a separation of the European Union? And also, is it a viable solution to save the European Union, a more stronger budget control for the European Union?
Can you repeat the last part?
That is it a viable solution in order to save the euro in a long term after they already find a short-term solution, to give it the European Union a stronger budgetarian control? Budget
Stronger
control.
budget control.
Yes.
There's a kind of trade-off there. Strong euro, budgetary control, fiscal union, etc. On aggregate, that can be good for Europe, but in our immediate region, state, etc., we lose some control over decisions because you know the most important feature of democracy is the control of the purse, the control of money. So That's going to be the value trade-off that you will have to decide. But the technocrats tell us that what you're asking is correct, that that's what you need in the long run if you're going to have a strong euro. What is more interesting is to see how this will work out with the old idea of Europa de vitesse, you know, two-speed Europe, etc. And that will be an interesting picture, because we already have de vitesse, right? Schengen is not all of Europe. The euro is not all of Europe. But if there is a real strengthening of economic management by the euro bloc, the 17, and the remaining 10, then the governance cleavage between the 17 and the 10 will deepen. And it will be interesting to try and understand what kind of Europe it is where you have really two parallel structures of governance, one of the euro bloc and one without the euro bloc. And that question will be much deeper if they really assume budgetary control, fiscal federalism, where Brussels dictates and has the powers to enforce fiscal discipline, etc. Ideally, now I have to hide behind the table. There should be a European income tax. Yes. Income tax is one of the strongest forms of democracy. It forces accountability. People then, it's they taking my money, what are they doing with my money? They have to explain to you and justify to you. Then suddenly the European Parliament will be important. People will vote for, no, maybe I'm wrong again. But if the European Parliament decides what level of taxes you pay, that will be extremely important to vote and make sure that your party is in power. So I once wrote an article published in El País called "No Representation Without Taxation." Because I said it's an absurd situation where Europe can pass laws, but the fiscal responsibility to financing these laws falls to the member states. If they don't have the means, they should not pass the law. No representation without taxation.
We've been talking that one of the failures of the European Union has been the lack of an authority or a real power in Europe. So my question is if you think that the enactment of the European Constitution could have been done without a constitutional power, without a constitutional separation of the three branches of power, or if the European Union will have to become in a federation of states?
It's a very good question. I'm going to rephrase your question. Is it possible to solve the question of authority and the question of democracy without Europe turning into some kind of federal state? That's really the question. And that's a hugely complicated question. If we say no, and many people say no, they say unless there's some form of federal state, we will never have the adequate authority and we will never have adequate democracy in the European Union. And then it becomes a tragic choice. Because one of the beautiful things of Europe, the really beautiful things of Europe, is that it managed to keep sovereign member states with strong national identities. The French are French and the Germans are German, the Italians, Italians, the Castilians are just teasing, the Spanish are Spanish, etc., and having a high degree of integration. Nobody in history has managed that. No other place in the world has managed that. That has been one of the unique achievements of Europe. Strong member states with strong national identities and yet a high level of integration. If it turns out that it's not sustainable and that to ensure adequate authority to solve crises like the euro crisis and to have a meaningful democracy, Europe has to turn into a United States of Europe, it's a real tragic choice because there's no federal state in history. They all say that they will preserve the identity of the separate units, etc. It's never succeeded. It's always ultimately the federal state overwhelms the constituent units. Australia, Canada, Austria, India, Every federal state you look at, even Switzerland, they call themselves the Confédération Helvétique, not even a federation, confederation. Confédération Helvétique, but it's Swiss much more than the cantons, etc. So that will be a huge choice for Europe. In the name of democracy and efficiency, do they want to become a United States of Europe and lose what I think is this wonderful diversity of national cultures and identities, etc., or to preserve the wonderful national identities and cultural diversity and all the rest, but remain, from a government point of view, less efficient, and from a democratic point of view, deficient? I don't know the answer. I know that that's the big question. Thank you very much.